All right, we're going to be talking about how evolution happens. So we kind of brought up the whole idea that it's changes over time and they're kind of subtle changes that all of a sudden are noticed based on things like where the animal or the plant lives and so on and so forth. So if we look at that giant timeline of the billions of years that the Earth has had life on it or been around, then this is kind of a neat thing to address. So we have to talk about Charles Darwin anytime we talk about evolution. So he was a naturalist. He loved being in nature and he studied things. So what he did was he went to the Galapagos Islands on the SS Beagle, which was a ship. And normally this wouldn't seem drastic in our day and age where we travel all the time and we go places. But even to this day, the Galapagos Islands are really known for their very unique species of different animals and things like that. So for that time, it was especially interesting. So there were lots of unique things living there. And he saw finches and birds with different beaks. He had never seen these types of beaks before. And so he kind of studied them and he wondered, why do they have different adaptations? Later, he realized that it was, of course, because he watched them eating different kinds of seeds. And so the beaks were shaped so that they were able to get those seeds. So somehow the birds adapted, right, over time, somehow, some way, so that they could survive. Remember, the goal of your species is to survive and then reproduce. So if you can adapt like that, right, then your species is probably going to survive and be able to do that. So traits we know are genetically determined characteristics. We've been talking about traits a lot when we talked about DNA and genetics and Punnett squares and all of that. An important term is selective breeding. So we do this in sort of the real world when we breed plants for specific reasons. For example, seedless grapes were not a normal way to receive grapes, right? But they were selectively bred so that they did not have seeds because they're annoying to us as humans when we eat, right? Also dogs, right? Some of us have dogs based on their selective traits that we want in a dog. Maybe one that doesn't shed or one that is good for hunting or certain characteristics, right? So we do this with different things, and that's an important piece to remember, that we pick out those traits that might benefit a certain situation and then we selectively breed. Mendel did this with his peas, right? So he used ones on purpose and crossed them to see how traits were actually inherited. So we can think of lots of examples of that, right? So Darwin really liked to read information by Malthus, right? So Malthus was a guy who looked at population and he said, look, there's not enough food for every living thing to be able to survive, right? It cannot support, the world cannot support an unlimited population. So those animals and organisms that can, in fact, find food and shelter and make their needs be met will, of course, survive and go on to reproduce, right? So there's disease, there's starvation, there's just not enough for everybody, right? So Darwin studied this too. And his ideas kind of came from that. So he came up with his, what we call theory of natural selection, right? So it's basically saying, look, individuals that have these traits that they can use to adapt to their environment and survive and then hopefully reproduce, they are going to, of course, be more successful than those that aren't adapting. So this picture is an important picture that we really need to take a look at. They use tarantulas in this picture. So these are his 4 factors, we say, that govern or that kind of guide natural selection. So the first one is overpopulation. In this picture, and I hope all of you saw Finding Nemo. That's a great movie to think about for this example. But remember, most living things lay way more eggs or have way more offspring than are really going to survive, right? In Finding Nemo, gosh, only 1 egg survived, right? But they lay between, in this case, tarantulas lay between 500 and 1,000 eggs, right? And some of them aren't going to survive. Okay, now we might think about humans for a second, right? Obviously, we don't usually have more, hopefully, children than survive, but we do know, right? We're talking about living things in general, okay? And we know also that our technology and our medical field has helped us be able to make, human life survive pretty well from, early on. So it looks a little different in humans, but the idea is more eggs are going to be produced than are really going to survive eventually. And if we look back in history, often we had disease and things like that that might have, happened in humans, or in childbirth, something might have happened. So think of it in general, okay? Inherited variation is our second one, right? Every individual has its own combination of traits. We are all a little bit different, right? We are not all the same. And so there's going to be traits that might help us be able to survive. We're not identical to our parents for the most part, okay? Or if we are, we're not probably going to survive as well. So there's a lot of different traits that we have to look at. The third one down here is the struggle to survive. It says some tarantulas may be caught by predators, such as this wasp. Others may starve or get a disease. Only some are going to survive to adulthood. All right, so that's kind of a sad thing to think about. But the truth is, it is the nature of how things are, right? And then finally on the bottom here, you can see successful reproduction, right? So if you're adapted to your environment, you're not going to be stressed about carrying on your traits, right, to the next generation. You're going to survive, you're going to reproduce, and you're going to probably have offspring that are going to survive because the conditions you've adapted to allow for that. So those are really important pieces to remember as we continue to talk about natural selection.